talk entitled Inventing Iraq, Inventing Iran, Britain's and Americans in the Middle East. And we're very pleased to have Karl E, writer and editorial board member of both the New York Times and the Washington Post, and his wife, Shareen Brysac, former producer for CBS News. He's also won a number of Emmys and the Peabody Award. Those of us who know Central Asia, of course, know their work, Tournament of Shadows, the great game in the race for empire in Central Asia, which came out in 1999, just as about the new race for Central Asia was about to begin. Any of you who have not read it, I would suggest that you do, because it's a great tale, because one of the things that happens, I know in other parts of the world, political playmakers tend to be boring, not in this part of the world. And so that even if you can't remember the dates and the places, you'll certainly remember the people. They followed up on this on a new book that's come out just recently, Kingmakers, Invention, the Modern Middle East, about the same kind of players. And as perhaps those of us who work in Central Asia don't think they have quite the same cachet or eccentricity as those we find in Central Asia, it does go to show that generation after generation, weirdness never ends. And that unfortunately that tends to have more to do with politics than considered reason. So without any further ado,
the Kingmakers grew out of our Central Asia and the Great Game. I did Shareen was the executive producer, and I was the sole author of a book called Dust of Empire, which took the story through the Caucasus and up to the present. And this is our third venture. And I just want to say first a couple of things about our overall approach and what our methodology was on this. That we live in an age where, quote, the grand narrative is very important. And there are really two basic, when you deal with historical events like this, two extreme and different grand narratives. You might call them the personal and impersonal. The personal grand narrative is a variation of the great man theory that the leaders create the reality around them, whereas the impersonal is the opposite, that says that there are impersonal forces, economic, geographical, and whatnot, which determine the course of history. And our own approach is that it's a mixture of the two. That it's quite obvious that the Middle East history would be very different if there was no oil, if its geography were different, but the fact that it was a mid-passage to India had automatic consequences for it. The fact that in the 20th century oil was discovered there had immense implications. So that's the impersonal thing. Now, as to the personal, we don't take the great man theory, but we are very much aware in our previous writings of what you might call the mid-level officials' importance. That although the people at the top may be, in George Bush's phrase, the deciders are usually deciding on the basis of scenarios that have been laid out for them by people in the mid-ranks, people who determine what the realistic alternative policy courses are, coming up with plan A, B, and C. Then the decider works within those parameters. This certainly, to our view, is what happened in the Middle East. And what we've done is we've tried to pick out key personalities, all of them in the middle ranks, who had an effect on the course of the Middle East, starting with Lord Cromer, the pro-counsel in Egypt, and ending with Paul Wolfowitz, one of the instrumental architects of the war in Iraq today. Let's start with, well, first let me just say one thing, that there are three aspects of the Middle East that seem to us important. And the talk that I'm about to give will deal with those three aspects. Then, after I talk for a while, Shareen and I will both answer questions and open it up to discussion. But the three aspects are political, economic, and military. I would say that on the political side, that you had a pattern of extra Middle Eastern penetration based on indirect rule rather than direct colonialism, as was the case elsewhere when the Europeans started moving towards Asia. Second, economic. Here I want to talk about the role that oil has played in the political destiny of the Middle East. And third, military. I want to discuss what were some of the strategic conclusions, particularly that the British reached, and which the Americans are now replicating in Iraq. Our first character in the book is Lord Cromer, born Evelyn Baring of the Baring banking dynasty, one of the great financial families in British imperial history, beginning in the 18th century and lasting indeed until the 1960s, when I was a correspondent in London. The director of the Bank of England was a Baring. And the Baring Company, until a few years ago, still existed. So he was born Evelyn Baring. He came up, as others did, through the Indian Civil Service, through the British Army, the Indian Civil Service, and from 1883 until 1905, he was the virtual ruler of Egypt, which was a paradox because, number one, Egypt was not part of the British Empire. It was nominally and officially a province of the Ottoman Empire, and the Khedive, who was the ruler of Egypt, was the Ottoman Sultan's representative. That was the theory. Secondly, Baring Cromer never had a title grander than Consul General of her, and later His Majesty's government in Cairo. He was the Consul General. Yet, as Consul General, he was the Supremo. And this, at his height of his power, meant that he was the fourth most powerful person in the British Empire, ranking after the Queen, the Prime Minister, the Viceroy of India. You had Baring. Now, what were the sources of Baring's power? There were threefold. First, in 1882, there was a colonel's revolt in Egypt. And this was a matter of keen concern to the British, then led by Prime Minister Gladstone, because in 1875, the British acquired majority shares of the Suez Canal Company. The Suez Canal was therefore a British possession, and the canal was, in the cliche of the time, the imperial lifeline, shortened the sea voyage to India from England from months to weeks. Second, the Khedives in Egypt were immemorially improvident and constantly had to borrow money, and this money was provided by European bondholders, chiefly British and French. And third, there was a growing European colony in Cairo, living in something very like the green zone that we have in Baghdad today. So when the colonels threatened to change the character of the British government, there was a concern that it might threaten the Suez Canal, the sanctity of the bondholders, and the lives of the European settlers. Gladstone, against his better instincts and reluctantly, because he had always been a critic of similar imperial adventures, authorized the invasion and occupation of Egypt, which took place in 1882, beginning with the bombardment of Alexandria. Then the British occupied Egypt. But from the beginning, Gladstone insisted, we are there only temporarily. We are there until we can help the Egyptians form a responsible government, until we can bring the joys of enlightenment and progress to a country sorely in need of them. Then we will depart. Well, variations of that same promise were made in the reckoning of A.J.P. Taylor at least 67 times until 1954, when, following the Nasserite rebellion and another colonel's revolt, the Egyptians finally forced the British to leave. Well, in that period, the British developed the premises of indirect rule. A second character in our book, unfortunately not as well known as he or his wife should have been, was Lord Frederick Blueguard. who was the creator virtually of what we know as Nigeria today. His wife, Flora Shaw, who in the 1890s was the colonial editor of the Times, was the first woman to exercise serious influence on British imperial policy in the Victorian period, aside from the Queen herself, of course. Lugard developed not just a policy, but a theory of indirect rule. And in Nigeria, which first as a governor general and then later as a high commissioner, he literally helped shape. This took the form of favoring the emirs the Muslim emirs of the north, and here we see Lugard meeting with a group of them, but also at the risk and at the cost of discriminating against the often Christian, missionary-educated, more urbanized Nigerians of the South, creating a cleavage in that society which persists to the present. And I should add that the name Nigeria was devised and first put into print by his wife, Flora Shaw. So he was the theorist, and the theory was that the political officer should be the whisperer behind the throne, but never, in any case, the throne to speak for the throne itself. Or, in the more vulgar rendition of another disciple, it was retinamir by a sheik. You had a climactic event which symbolized both the limitations and frustrations of indirect rule and its end. In the next picture, Shareen, this is obviously President Nasser of Egypt, and the year was 1955 when Anthony Eden, then the Foreign Secretary, soon to be the Prime Minister succeeding Churchill of Great Britain, made his one and only trip to Cairo and had his one and only meeting with Nasser, who was then president. At this meeting, before they got together, the president asked Eden, said, could we meet at the British Embassy? When he got at the British Embassy, arrived at the British Embassy in Cairo, they came into the room, the inner room, and Nasser said, oh, here I am. I've always wanted to be in the room in which Britain ruled Egypt for so long. And Eden immediately said, and he never called him president, he always called him colonel. He said, oh, surely not Colonel Nasser, not ruled, merely advised. But the hypocrisy of the situation where you had a country that was nominally a sovereign country that was actually being governed by others created the tensions within the society, which I can elaborate later, that brought about the frustrations and end of that form of indirect rule. Yet, what was the British policy going to be in the Middle East when World War I broke out? We commonly forget that the role of India was crucial for the British in World War I, that more than 1 million Anglo-Indian officers and soldiers fought on the Allied side, and not only did they fight, but under the arrangement at that time, it was a very economical deal because the, quote, ordinary costs of sending the troops overseas and maintaining them was borne by the British Indian government, meaning that the London government, on the cheap, was getting a very large pool of manpower, which meant also that the Viceroy and the others of the British Indian government felt that they should have an important role in deciding what the future of the Middle East would be. In 1914, some months after the outbreak of the war, the Ottoman emperors, then rulers, made the unwise decision of coming in on the side of the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. And almost immediately, the British moved their Anglo-Indian forces across the Persian Gulf to Basra and upward from Basra. Eventually, they came to Baghdad. And here we see General Maud arriving in Baghdad in March 1917. Now, in London at the time, there was a fierce debate about what to do with the Ottoman territories that the British were occupying. Basically, there were three broad views from three centers of influence. One, the Indians, I've just suggested, that is the British Indians, saw the Middle East chiefly as a formal protectorate of the British Empire and place for colonization from India. A second view was from Cairo, where in 1916 the British organized the Arab Bureau, the most famous operative being, of course, Lawrence of Arabia. And the Cairo Arab Bureau view was, number one, that the Arabs, in whatever form, details to be resolved later, should have self-government and should be a sovereign entity in the Middle East. And number two, that at all costs we should reduce the role of the French, the great rivals of the British, for the future of the Middle East. That was the view there. Then you had the problem from the third source, which is Whitehall, the British government. Now, on the British government side, one thing that they had to worry about was placating both the French and the Russians, who also had designs on this, and that they were navigating between them. And so you had the personalities representing these different views. Anglo-Indian personality, almost totally forgotten today, was A.T. Lawrence, an officer of the British Indian Army and the Civil Commissioner of Iraq. Wilson, A.T. Wilson, personified the protectorate imperial view. He, from the beginning, thought and believed that what was Mesopotamia and was soon called Iraq should be a colony of the British Empire. He also knew, for reasons I will mention in a minute, a lot about oil. And he was concerned that the new entity called Iraq should be economically viable. And to do that, he proposed and urged that the province of Mosul, which had been promised to the French and which was attached to Syria, should be joined to the provinces of Basra and Baghdad, forming the three provinces, forming the new government. So intent and determined was Wilson to bring that about, that in November 1918, when the armistice was finally secured, and the war was supposed to be over 3 days after, when peace was out, British forces occupied Mosul. Then, having occupied Mosul, Wilson went to the Paris Peace Conference, prevailed upon Lloyd George, the then Prime Minister of Britain, to join those three provinces. This is the architectural, this is the territorial architect of today's Iraq, A.T. Wilson. Lloyd George prevailed then upon Clemenceau for the adjoining of the three towns, and the die was then cast. But there were other views. A representative of the other view was Gertrude Bell, an extraordinary woman, born of a well-to-do industrial family in the east of England, one of the first women to be admitted to Oxford, where she qualified for a first in history. However, at that time, Oxford did not grant degrees to women. It was only after World War I that women were allowed to have the documents saying that they were bachelors or doctors, etc. But so brilliant was Gertrude Bell that having traveled extensively in the Ottoman Middle East, by then being conversant in Farsi and Arabic, and having written a series of books on it, that when the war broke out, the British prevailed on her to join, to go and help out, and she became part of the Arab Bureau. Now, initially, Gertrude Bell sided with Wilson, that protectorate was the desired future for Iraq. However, at the Paris Peace Conference, she came under the influence first of Lawrence of Arabia, who was there representing the pro-Arab view, and then also of the Prince Faisal, who Lawrence hoped would be the future claimant to a throne that was to be created in Iraq as part of the Faisal was a Hashemite. The Hashemite dynasty historically had been the Sharifs protecting Mecca and Medina, and they, in Lawrence's view, would be the ideal thing. Well, Gertrude Bell not only decided that there was more merit in the Lawrentian view, but going back to Iraq, we have the next picture is the, we come first, I should say, there was 3 events here that are important. The first, in Iraq, having been promised when General Maud went into Baghdad in 1917, that the British came as not as conquerors but as liberators. The Iraqis, after World War I, were dismayed to discover that the British and French promises of self-determination in the Middle East were empty. A revolt broke out in 1920, lasted 6 months, claimed 10,000 Iraqi lives, and hundreds of British military were killed. It was put down at a time that the British were beset by a civil war in Ireland, by riots in India, by riots in Egypt. They were fighting against the Bolshevik armies in Central Asia and the Caucasus, and they were broke from the end at the end of World War I. So Lloyd George at the time decided, this was the second big decision, to turn to the guy who could fix it up. And the guy who could fix it up was Winston Churchill, who then became the colonial secretary. And Churchill decided, third big event, to summon a conference in Cairo in 1921. And the conference, here we have a famous picture in which you can see Gertrude Bell in the middle, and then to the left, that's Winston Churchill, and then on the other side is Lawrence of Arabia in an unfamiliar civilian clothes. Churchill, when he dismounted, stumbled and fell off, and Clementine mercilessly teased him, yet he brought off in 2 weeks a tour de force. The 40 delegates who Churchill called the 40 thieves, who were mostly British officials, made 3 basic decisions. Decision 1, that Iraq should be a monarchy and that the Hashemites should be the dynasty ruling it. Decision 2, a new kingdom would be created called Transjordan. And Churchill in his memoir says that he created Jordan with a stroke of his pen on a sunny afternoon in Jerusalem. And another Hashemite claimant, Faisal's older brother Abdullah, became the candidate for the Jordanese throne. The third decision was to carry out a promise that the British made in the Balfour Declaration to create a national homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine, ratified in Cairo and begun. Right after the conference, in pursuant to decision number 1, you had the coronation of Faisal. Now, the interesting thing is that Gertrude Bell designed the entire coronation ceremony, as well as the furniture that was in the new palace. And when Shareen and I, a month ago, were at Newcastle, where we saw Gertrude Bell's letters, there was one letter, it was a very interesting letter, where she had a sketch of the Iraqi flag, and the letter was to her father, Sir Hugh Bell. Father, dear, telegraph me soonest. This is what we were proposing for the new Iraqi flag. Advise me, is it heraldically correct? He wired back that it was, and it is the present-day Iraqi flag. So that you had the carrying out of that and the invention of Iraq. But now we come to the military part of the problem. This was not an area that was easy to subdue, police, administer. One reason was geographical. Here we have the Marsh Arabs territory in southern Iraq, and you can see just by looking at it, it was not an area that would lend itself to tank warfare, to armored cars, to infantry battalions. It took some other form of military subjection. Well, Churchill became the great prophet of RAF air power, and the British in Iraq and elsewhere in the Middle East turned to air power as the means at a minimum cost of subduing large areas and assuring the submission by the indigenous peoples. The problem that they had and that the Americans today have is that many civilians in the process were killed and that there was an enduring bitterness. Also, a subsidiary problem that the Americans have inherited was the problem of the legal immunity of the military personnel in Iraq at the time were protected under what we now call the Status of Forces Agreement, i.e. that the military personnel were immune not only to local laws, but in the case of Iraq in the 1920s and 30s, to local taxes. So these were problems that came up, but it was important. Meanwhile, Gertrude, here we see her at a picnic, and Faisal is there, had made an important political decision, and that is that she persuaded, and this is again the importance of people in the middle, persuaded her superiors to turn first and foremost in Iraq to the urbanized Sunni elite in around Baghdad and elsewhere in the country, at the expense of what was already at the time a Shia majority in the country, with consequences that we deal with today. So you have the military problem, which I have just described briefly, a solution being used, air power, and you had finally the third element that I want to talk about, the importance of oil. There were two big anniversaries this year that were landmarks in Middle East history and of the West's involvement with the area that have hardly been mentioned. And the first landmark was May 1908, 100 years ago, in the Zagros Mountains of Iran. You had the first major strike of oil by a British consortium. And I mentioned earlier that Wilson knew a lot about oil. Colonel Wilson, as he then was indeed present at the time. He was leading a contingent of Bengal Lancers, and he ordered the Lancers immediately to surround that derrick that you see there, to treat it as if it were British territory. So that was the beginning of the British involvement in oil, and there was a critical reason why the British were concerned, and that is, do we have the next picture? And again, we come back to Churchill. This is early in the 20th century. Churchill, accompanied by one of the more remarkable and influential figures in military history, Jackie Fisher. Jackie Fisher, then the first Sea Lord, was an oil maniac. That he wanted to see that the dreadnoughts and the capital ships in the British Navy moved from coal to oil, which was cheaper, more efficient, easier to, in every way it made more sense. But the British Empire, rich in many things, did not have any, at that time, realizable oil assets. They had to import it all. Hence, when they found the oil in Iran, it became a vital concern to maintain access to that oil. And indeed, when the British moved in at the beginning of World War I, the very first order that they had was to secure access to the Persian oil fields. So here you have the British with a head start in the Middle East in oil. World War I is over, and there was a determination in London to do all that they could to limit access by other foreign competitors to the British, to the Middle East oil. And heading the list of people that they were anxious to keep out was the United States. Well, the second anniversary brought an end to the British monopoly on power, control over Middle East oil. Second anniversary was May 1933. That's 75 years ago. The place is Jeddah. The personages involved were Ibn Saud, who, a tribal warlord who in the 1920s unified and created what in 1930 became Saudi Arabia, giving his family name to the kingdom. And on the left is Hilary St. John Philby, Jack Philby. Some of you may know that we'll come to that in a minute, why Philby's name is so notorious. But Philby, at that time, had just left the British Imperial Service. He had disagreed with the conclusions reached after World War I about the Middle East, feeling that the Arabs had been cheated of the promises of self-determination made to them, resigned and became an unpaid advisor to Ibn Saud. This was in 1925. He subsequently also converted to Islam, but he had a financial problem. He had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. and they were going to boarding school in England. And he needed school fees for them. The son was just entering Cambridge. The son, of course, is Kim Philby, later the most notorious Soviet counter-spy in the British intelligence service, part of the Cambridge Five that went on. But Philby needed the money for his children's fees, and at that time, Ibn Saud said at one point to Philby, and he relates in his memoirs, "Oh, Philby, if some American would come along and offer me $1 million, £1 million, I'd give them anything they wanted in the way of oil." Oil was just beginning to be discovered in other places besides Iran and the Middle East. And Philby said, "Oh, well, there's an American in the area, Charles Crane. Let's bring him over." And Crane came to look over Saudi Arabia, and he brought with him an engineer named Twitchell. And Twitchell thought, well, it might be fresh water, we don't know what's there. Bahrain had just been surveyed and was producing oil, but let's look around. Twitchell went to the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, and he liked the structure of it, and he persuaded Standard Oil of California that there was enough promise to make a serious bid for Saudi oil. This was done. Philby then, without anybody knowing about it, was getting $1,000 a month from so-called Standard Oil of California in order to lobby for the British bidder in the competition. This arrangement did not become public until long after Philby's death. So in 1933, the contract went not to the British consortium, which felt that they would get it, but to Standard Oil of California. Philby, in his memoirs, relates that he had a monthly meeting with Sir Hugh Ryan, the British Consul General in Jeddah, and he said at the end of that meeting, I said, "Oh, by the way, Sir Hugh, I forgot to mention His Majesty this week decided to give the concession to the Americans." And he says in his thing that Ryan's face became purple with rage and frustration because he thought that his influence would tilt the bid to the British. Well, when they started drilling, they soon discovered in a few years that there was so much oil in Saudi Arabia that one company was not sufficient to carry out and exploit it. They joined a partnership with Standard Oil of New Jersey and with Exxon to form what became Aramco. Now, the significance of this was that the Americans had a different and more generous view of how much oil that they would share with the host governments. In the 1950s, Aramco struck a 50-50 bargain with the Saudis, i.e. that 50% of the royalties from Aramco oil would remain with the host government, the rest would go to the stockholders and investors in Aramco. Well, at that time, the British-controlled companies in the Middle East were offering from 15, 20, not more than 30% of the royalties. And this new bargain was eagerly taken up in Iran by a nationalist named Mohammed Mossadegh. And Mossadegh, who was the promoter of the nationalization of the Iranian oil, became the Man of the Year for Time magazine. That's his picture on the cover in 1951. And the British were absolutely indignant. It was a Labour government in Britain, and you would have thought they would have a more liberal view, but no, on the contrary, they regarded it as terrible. As the saying went, why is it that our oil is under their soil, and what can we do about it? The initial idea that the British came up with was regime change. And in order to bring about a regime change, they did a scenario called Operation Boot. And they came to Washington to get American support for Operation Boot, Boot being to boot out Mossadegh. And at the time, President Truman was the chief executive, and the Secretary of State was Dean Acheson, neither of whom really sympathized with the British on this, and did their best to bring about some kind of reasonable compromise between the sides, but failed. 1952, Dwight Eisenhower was elected. In comes John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State, and John Foster's younger brother, Alan, becomes the Director of Central Intelligence. The British then try again, and this time, instead of talking about the iniquities of the Iranian government on the economic side, they talked about the Cold War threat of Soviet influence penetrating Iran, the possibility that Mossadegh would lean to the east, and that a country of crucial economic and geographical and strategic importance would become part of the Soviet orbit. Therefore, the Americans in 1953 approved Operation Ajax, based on Operation Boot, and put in charge the man we see here. That's Kermit Kim Roosevelt, the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, a Harvard-educated Arabist who was then the head of CIA operations in Cairo, who in 1953 summer turns up in Tehran with $100,000 in small Iranian bills and settles in to see if he can bring about a regime change. The initial scenario they devised was that the Shah, at that time wobbly and unsure of himself, was prevailed upon to dismiss Mossadegh as prime minister, the elected prime minister, I should add, and to reappoint as the new prime minister a general who was a crony of the Shah's. Well, Mossadegh, when he got the firmans announcing these decisions, dismissed them both as forgeries. He said, I don't believe that these are the Shah's things, that this is a foreign plot and a conspiracy. He then brought about and orchestrated demonstrations in support of his government, and the Shah, fearing that it was over and that he'd lost out, took flight, went first to Iraq, then flew with the Empress to Rome. And at that time, it looks as if the American scheme had misfired. However, Kim Roosevelt, with his satchel of money and his contacts, then went about organizing a series of counter-demonstrations. And each night, he was nervous about the outcome. He would play Luck Be a Lady Tonight, and luck, on his terms, proved a lady, because the army, which had wavered between the Shah and Mossadegh, finally came down on the Shah's side, arrested Mossadegh, and a reporter turned up in Rome at the Excelsior Hotel where the Shah was staying and informed the Shah of what had happened, and he said, I always knew my people loved me. He flew back to Iran, and there was a meeting at the palace, and he said to Kim Roosevelt, I owe my throne to God, my people, and to you. This is a story and an episode and a name, Mossadegh, known throughout the Middle East, and is one of the turning points in our history of our relations there, because until then the United States had been favorably regarded as the champions of the indigenous peoples. With that, you had the new injection of a conspiracy so that everything was seen suspiciously as a design one way or another, right down to 9/11. Well, these were the background for our book. And we now face the consequences. And let me just say something about the politics, the economics, and the military side of it. On the political side, as we've tried to show in this, that there was a determination on the part of the European powers that created the Middle East after World War I to rely not on direct rule, but indirect rules and rule through surrogates. The United States has followed in that course too. And we have had many of the same problems that the British had before, because indirect rule, by contrast with direct rule, in India, for example, the word Raj means rule, that there was never any question as to who was in charge in India, that even in the princely places where there were Maharajas, each Maharaja signed a declaration that he was subordinate to the British government. There was never a question about it. But under indirect rule, you have the fiction that you're a country, and everybody knows that the people in charge are really puppets. It's quite interesting that the four most violent eruptions against traditional European and American imperial power have been in countries that were never formally colonies, or were not colonies at the time. and that would be Egypt, Iraq, Iran, and Cuba. So that was one of the legacies of the past. The second, economic. You know about oil, it's worth noting what happened after World War I in Iraq. The British formed something called the Iraqi Petroleum Company, the IPC. And in the 1920s, the Iraqi government wanted to buy 21% share of the equity in IPC so that they would have a share in the government of the company and represented on the board of directors. The British said, no, you don't want to be bothered with all the headaches of management and so on. Said, instead, we promise you a 13% share of the royalties on oil, and we'll advance it against the future so that, well, after much negotiations in 1930, the Iraqi government borrowed 300,000 pounds, then quite a large sum, as an advance against future royalties from oil. At the time, the oil market was depressed. There was a surplus, a global surplus. Also, that the IPC was keeping and not developing the reserves that were there, so that the Iraqi government found itself perpetually in debt to a company that was extracting its major resource. This was one of the abiding grievances that the people have there, and it's quite interesting, and I'll come to the final point on the military side. On the military side, the problems of relying on air power, of creating immunities for the troops, bred an abiding controversy. In 1930, the British and the Iraqis signed a treaty that nominally led the way to Iraq becoming a sovereign country, a sovereign member of the League of Nations. However, the British they kept bases in perpetuity, number one. Number two, that the British officers were put in charge of a lot of the key things in the Iraqi army, and that all the military equipment that the Iraqis acquired had to come from Britain, and in all these ways that they became a military appendage of the British, who also said that the Iraqi foreign policy should be done in consultation with the British. So in 1958, you had a bloody revolt in which the Hashemite family was wiped out. The 14 times prime minister, who had been the pro-British prime minister, was lynched on the street. And the beginning of those events that led to the rise of the Baathists and Saddam Hussein. So that was the military legacy of it. All of this is very relevant for what's happening to Iraq today, in that the next president will face these problems. On December 31st, the agreement under which the U.S. troops have their presence in Iraq expires. It was approved by the Security Council. There have been negotiations ongoing as to a new agreement. The stumbling blocks have been bases, status of forces agreement, and oil laws. So that you can see that this history that we were talking about before is as relevant today, even more relevant today than at any time. And again, we're going to have the problem of who is going to be advising, who will be the successor to the British officers we were talking about in spelling out the choices that the new government will have. I'll end right there, and we're delighted to just answer any questions we can. And Shareen, why don't you come up and...
Yeah, we'd be happy to answer questions. Yes?
So if you were appointed by Barack Obama to be foreign policy advisor with regard to the Middle East, what will you offer to the government?
Well, one of the things he seems to be doing, what I think both of us think, is close down Guantanamo. That is the single most deplorable thing that the United States is doing, which is totally un-American. This is not what we use. Torture and all the things that have happened there is not what we've been brought up to believe is an American thing to do. And somebody, I thought quite amusingly, said, well, because the problem then is what you do with all the people in Guantanamo if you close it down. Well, certain people, they don't have anything against, they should obviously let them go. But somebody suggested they should send them all to Crawford, Texas. They've got plenty of barbed wire, plenty of room at the Bush Ranch, and maybe that's where they should go. But that's one of the things that they've got to do. I mean, it's a question where the Middle East is going to be in terms of all the other priorities. I mean, the economy is obviously going to be the first priority. And so the Middle East sort of slips down there. I mean, I think they should certainly try and solve the Israeli-Palestine problem, which may or may not be too late. I mean, they certainly should go after the. It's been stagnating for this whole Bush administration. Clinton made some progress in that area, but not enough. He got distracted by Monica Lewinsky and all of that had happened. So I think that needs to be done. They've got to get the settlements off the West Bank. And I think that Olmert, one of his sort of final things was he agreed with that. Let's do something about the West Bank and take back the settlements. So that may be a way of budging that whole thing. Obviously, the Saudis and the Turks use them to negotiate. They're both willing to do it. And the real problem, I think, is going to be how do you stop a civil war? And I don't know who's going to have a solution for that, because it's not going to be just a civil war with Iraq, because you'll have the Saudis coming in on side of the Sunnis, the Iranians coming in with the Shiites, and the Turks attacking the Kurds from the north. So it's going to be regional, the problem, if they don't prevent a civil war. So we've got to somehow figure out how we're going to leave, and that's what Karl was trying to address.
Well, and I should say that there have been some glimmers of positive glimmers. One is that both President-elect Obama and the Iraqi government have agreed broadly on a timetable for withdrawal. And if the initiative is taken by the Iraqi government to call for an end and a phasing out of the U.S. military occupation, that would be something where the Americans could claim victory and say this is what the whole thing was about. That's one thing that could be done. And I just want to add to what Shareen said, that I've been interested that King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia is presently in New York at an interfaith conference under the auspices of the United Nations, bringing together the leaders of the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic community to discuss more harmonious relations, which is in one way paradoxical, because in Saudi Arabia itself, the only religion that's allowed is Islam. There are mosques but no churches and no synagogues. Nevertheless, Abdullah, who has called for returning to the 1967 frontiers as a key to a two-state solution that he says all the Arab countries would recognize, has opened a door. And as we were reminded by Sarah Palin the other night, if the door opens, God seems to indicate that you can go forward into it. So there's a gleam of hope in that respect.
One other thing to add, I think you have to use the countries, the Syrians particularly, and I think you do have to talk to the Iranians, and Obama's kind of shown his willingness to talk to them. It would probably also be helpful if you stopped running raids into Iran from Baluchistan. This is a very underreported story in the United States, but it seems to be happening. So I think getting the Syrians on board, getting the Iranians on board is the only way you're going to be able to stop a really bad civil war in Iraq. More questions?
This is partially about your earlier book, but I spent 18 months living in Istalif, which...
In where?
Istalif, burned down by Eldred Pottinger, the hero of Iran, of course, in 1842, Retribution. So there's still hold a bit of a grudge. But one of the things I found was talking to a lot of sort of military folk over there. I was amazed and impressed, I guess, at how popular your book was and Peter Hochberg's book. And a lot of these guys, I think, are sort of bored on army bases reading this stuff. But always their interpretation of it, they always seem to sort of run with the romanticization of particularly the first Anglo-Afghan War. And I mean, the most popular problem now at the Gandamak Lodge, and you can buy the replica rifles on Chicken Street. And it seems to me that a lot of the history of this region is not being used as well as it could because it's so romanticized, that they're not taking the real geographic and social, and it's sort of lost in the narrative.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And, you know, I'm struck by the fact that Sir Percy Sykes, in his book about Afghanistan, likened it to Switzerland. He says Switzerland is, you know, another mountain-bound country without access to the sea. But there's a great difference, and the great difference points up to me what seems to me the problem in Afghanistan. In Switzerland, all the adjoining countries, the Germans, the French, the Poles, the Russians, etc., have decided, unwritten, not to meddle in internal Swiss affairs to back factions, whether they're French-speaking, German-speaking, or Italian-speaking factions within Switzerland, and to respect the integrity and neutrality of Switzerland, because it served all their joint conveniences. They wanted a place they could bank their money, and it had a certain payoff. No such proposal has been made, and yet that may be the one thing that would be the key to the real security in Afghanistan, is if all the countries in the region and outside the region that have been fighting surrogate wars there said, we're all going to let the Afghans handle their own problems. That would really turn a page, and that would unlock what I think has been one of the most serious problems that you have within Afghanistan. Almost a dozen different countries with their agents there vying for influence, of which the United States is, of course, a major one.
Well, I also think that, I mean, you've been to Afghanistan, you're an Afghan authority, that they haven't really learned the lessons from the past at all, because you had these butcher and beat it raids that the British used to do every spring. They'd go up and they'd fight the people on the northwest, the Pathans on the northwest frontier. And then they'd declare a truce and everybody'd go home and they'd be back the next spring. The British would get their medals, or we knew somebody whose father was engaged in this and said, well, the Pathans would come and say, well, why don't we get medals? And so that happened. They tried bombing Kabul in the Third Afghan War. In fact, the strategy of bombing was tried out originally on the Afghans, this shock and awe. And then they brought it into Iraq. So they tried that, of hitting them with, armor-piercing weapons, all that sort of thing, so that they haven't really figured out what to do it. I mean, and then you've got the poppy problem that seemed to have been solved at one point by the Taliban, but it's back. So I don't know what you do about it, but you're using the same old kinds of things that proved ineffective in the past if they had just studied it, and are not necessarily what is going to happen in the future. I think they did have a chance if they just pursued the Afghan war instead of trying to go do it in Iraq, but now it doesn't look. Maybe Obama can get a lot more people on board. I mean, maybe he can get a lot of the Europeans to send troops, money. Money is very much needed, and I don't know, though, with the global economy as what it is, people have the taste to really send more men and material to Afghanistan. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes?
I read that there's sort of a divide between NATO forces there, U.S. wanting to press on the British and the French and Canadians. They all get very gloomy about what they're doing there. I guess I've got a two-part question. Who would you tend to side with? Like, what would you say they should do in Afghanistan exactly? And two, do you see anything in the Obama-Biden ticket that would suggest something will go well?
Well, I think this, perhaps because he's got a lot of political capital in Europe now, that he can maybe mobilize a lot more people in the world to help us out there. And that would make a big difference if that, but that's about all he could do, I think.
No, I would say that if you start out by saying that the essential problem in Afghanistan, as it is in Iraq, is not military but political, and that you're seeking a political settlement. And that if you open the way to talking first with the Taliban, because the Taliban is divided within itself on a lot of these things, and that you would reopen the possibility of a dialogue, bringing in well-wishing people from the outside, it might be possible that a country that has experienced now 30, 40 years of incessant violence would be ready finally to look towards a compromise solution in which you would have power sharing. And I say this knowing that there are people much more learned than I am who have been recently in Kabul. What do you think? Have you got any thoughts?
Well, too many.
Well, thank you very much for coming.
If any of you want to buy copies of our book, it's out there.
We'll be glad to sign it.